Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. I hope you are all doing well today. And as always, we are here not only to help you improve your English listening skills, but also to explore important global topics in a clear, thoughtful, and meaningful way. And today, we begin with a situation that feels serious, complex, and deeply important for the entire world. Because right now, ceasefire talks are beginning with Iran. And this is not just another political headline, but a moment that is raising a powerful and difficult question across the global stage. A question that many people are quietly asking and trying to understand, which is whether these talks represent a step toward peace through smart diplomacy, or whether they suggest that the United States is slowly losing control over a situation that has become more complicated than expected. Because when powerful nations enter negotiations during times of tension, it often signals that something significant is changing beneath the surface, something that requires careful attention and deeper understanding.
Yes, Adam, and what makes this moment even more important for us to discuss is the fact that when we hear the words ceasefire talks, it may sound simple at first, almost like a positive step toward peace. But in reality, it carries many layers of meaning that are not always immediately visible, because a ceasefire is not always the end of a conflict. Sometimes it is a pause, sometimes it is a strategy, and sometimes it is a sign that both sides are facing pressures that are forcing them to reconsider their next moves. And this is exactly why people around the world are paying close attention right now, because they understand that when talks begin during a tense situation, it often means that the balance of power, the level of control, and the direction of the conflict may be shifting in ways that are not yet fully clear.
That is a very important point, Julia, because when we talk about ceasefire talks in international relations, we are not just talking about stopping fighting. We are talking about a process where leaders, diplomats, and decision-makers come together to communicate, negotiate, and try to manage a situation that could otherwise become more dangerous. And in many cases, these talks are influenced by a combination of factors such as military pressure, economic challenges, political goals, and international expectations. And this means that every decision made during these discussions is carefully calculated, because the outcome can affect not only the countries directly involved, but also the stability of entire regions and even the global system as a whole.
Exactly, Adam. And what makes this situation even more interesting is the central question that people are beginning to ask, which is whether the start of these talks reflects strength or weakness. Because on one hand, some may see negotiations as a smart and responsible way to prevent further conflict and reduce risks, while on the other hand, some may interpret them as a sign that the situation has become difficult to control, and that one side may be facing challenges that are pushing it toward dialogue instead of direct action. And this is where global politics becomes both fascinating and complex, because the same event can be understood in very different ways depending on perspective, experience, and strategic thinking.
And this is exactly why today's topic is so important for all of us, especially for those who want to understand how the world works beyond simple headlines. Because what we are witnessing is not just a single event, but a moment that reflects deeper patterns in international relations, where power is not only shown through action, but also through restraint, communication, and timing. And in a world where countries are connected through economics, security, and diplomacy, even a decision to begin talks can carry significant meaning, because it may indicate that leaders are trying to manage risks, respond to pressures, or reshape the direction of a situation that could have serious consequences if left unchecked.
I completely agree, Adam. And I think it is also important for our listeners to understand that situations like this do not happen suddenly or without reason, because behind every ceasefire discussion, there is usually a series of events, decisions, and developments that lead to that moment. And while we may not always see every detail, we can still analyze the situation carefully and try to understand why talks are happening now, what each side might be hoping to achieve, and how these discussions could influence the future, not only for the countries involved, but also for the wider international community that is watching closely and preparing for different possible outcomes.
Absolutely, Julia. And before we go deeper into this important and thought-provoking discussion, we would like to take a moment to connect with all our dear listeners who are joining us from around the world, because your support means a lot to us and helps us continue creating valuable content for you. So if you find this episode helpful and interesting, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share it with your friends who want to improve their English while also learning about important global issues in a simple and clear way. And we would also love to hear from you, so do not forget to tell us in the comments where you are listening from and what you think about today's topic, because your opinions and perspectives make this learning journey more interactive, more meaningful, and more connected.
And it is also important to mention, Adam, that today's discussion is designed to be educational, balanced, and thoughtful, because our goal is not to take sides or make strong judgments, but to help our listeners understand the situation from different angles, to explore the possible reasons behind these developments, and to encourage critical thinking. Because when we look at global politics carefully, we begin to realize that things are rarely as simple as they appear, and that behind every major decision, there are layers of strategy, pressure, and long-term planning that shape the actions of countries and leaders.
Yes, Julia, and one of the most interesting aspects of this situation is how it highlights the idea that control in global politics is not always clear or absolute, because even powerful nations can face complex challenges that require careful handling. And sometimes the decision to move toward dialogue instead of confrontation can be seen as a sign of intelligence and responsibility, while at other times it may raise questions about influence and direction. And this is exactly the kind of complexity that makes international relations such an important subject to understand, especially in a time when global events can affect people's lives in many different ways.
That is a very powerful observation, Adam, because it reminds us that in today's world, decisions made by leaders are not only about immediate results, but also about long-term consequences, relationships between countries, and the overall stability of the global system. And this is why moments like the beginning of ceasefire talks are so important, because they represent a point where different paths are possible, where the situation could move toward calm and cooperation, or where challenges could continue if the talks do not lead to meaningful progress.
So as we begin this discussion together, we invite you to listen carefully, think deeply, and consider the different perspectives that we will explore throughout this episode. Because this is not just a story about one country or one decision, but about how modern global politics works in a world that is constantly changing, where power, strategy, and communication all play a role in shaping the future. And as we move forward, keep this central question in your mind, because it will guide everything we talk about today.
And as we continue, remember that understanding global events is not about finding simple answers, but about asking better questions, staying informed, and developing a balanced view of the world. Because when we take the time to analyze situations like this carefully, we become more aware, more thoughtful, and more prepared to understand the bigger picture behind the headlines.
Because in the end, what we are witnessing is more than just the beginning of ceasefire talks. It is a moment where strategy, pressure, and uncertainty come together in a way that could shape the direction of an entire region and influence global stability.
And perhaps the most important question remains this, a question that many are asking, but few can answer with certainty.
Ceasefire talks have begun. But does this signal a path to peace or a shift in global power? When we try to understand why ceasefire talks are beginning at this particular moment, it becomes very important to carefully look at how the situation between the United States and Iran developed over time, because this is not a sudden crisis that appeared overnight, but rather the result of a long series of political tensions, regional conflicts, and strategic decisions that slowly increased pressure on both sides. And in recent months, this situation has become even more sensitive due to rising military activity in key areas of the Middle East, where different groups, alliances, and national interests have created an environment where even small actions can quickly lead to larger consequences, making it more difficult for leaders to control the direction of events.
Yes, Adam. And what makes this situation especially important for our listeners to understand is the way in which small and separate events can slowly connect and build into a much bigger issue. Because in international relations, nothing happens in isolation. And even a limited incident, such as a regional clash, a political statement, or a shift in military presence, can lead to reactions from other sides. And those reactions can then trigger further responses, creating a chain of cause and effect that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. And this is exactly how tensions between countries can grow over time without a single clear starting point.
That is absolutely right, Julia, because if we look at the recent developments in a simple and clear way, we can see that there have been several moments where tensions increased step by step, including reports of military movements, strategic warnings, and strong political messages from both sides. And while each of these actions may have been intended to send a signal or protect national interests, they also contributed to a situation where trust became weaker and uncertainty became stronger. And when trust decreases between countries, even normal actions can be misunderstood, which increases the risk of escalation and makes communication more difficult.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where the idea of cause and effect becomes very important, because one action often leads to another, and sometimes leaders may respond not only to what is happening in the present, but also to what they expect might happen in the future, which means that decisions are often influenced by both reality and perception. And this can make situations more complicated, because if one side believes that the other side is preparing for a stronger move, it may react in advance, and this kind of thinking can quickly increase tension, even if both sides are trying to avoid a direct conflict.
And another important factor to consider is the role of the region itself, because the Middle East is a place where many different interests come together, including political alliances, economic concerns, and security priorities. And this means that any tension between major countries like the United States and Iran does not stay limited to just those two sides, but instead affects other countries in the region, which may respond in different ways depending on their own interests. And this creates a more complex situation where multiple players are involved, making it harder to find simple solutions.
I completely agree, Adam. And this is why we often see situations where a series of smaller developments slowly turns into a larger and more serious issue. Because when different events begin to connect, they create a bigger picture that is more difficult to control. And this is exactly what seems to have happened in this case, where ongoing tensions, regional pressures, and strategic decisions have all combined to bring both sides to a point where continuing in the same direction could become risky. And this is often the moment when leaders begin to consider alternative approaches, such as dialogue and negotiation.
Yes, Julia, and it is also important to understand that in many cases, leaders do not move toward talks immediately, but only after they feel that the situation has reached a level where communication becomes necessary, because continuing without dialogue may increase risks or create outcomes that are difficult to manage. And this is why the beginning of ceasefire talks can sometimes be seen as a response to growing pressure, where both sides recognize that they need to slow things down and create space for discussion, even if their positions have not fully changed.
That is a very important point, Adam, because it shows us that the path toward negotiations is often shaped by a combination of events rather than a single decision. And when we look at the situation this way, we begin to understand that ceasefire talks are not just about the present moment, but about everything that led to it, including past tensions, recent developments, and the growing realization that continuing escalation may not lead to a stable outcome. And this is why understanding the background is so important for anyone who wants to see the full picture.
So when we ask what led to this moment, the answer is not simple or direct, but instead involves a series of connected events that increased tension step by step, reduced trust over time, and created a situation where both sides are now facing important decisions about what to do next. And this is exactly why the start of ceasefire talks is such a significant development, because it represents a shift from action to communication, from escalation to cautious discussion, even if the final outcome is still uncertain.
And as we continue our discussion, it is important for our listeners to remember this key idea that in global politics, big moments are often created by many smaller ones. And by understanding how these pieces come together, we can better understand not only what is happening now, but also what might happen in the future, because every step in this process plays a role in shaping the direction of the situation.
Because in the end, what we are seeing today is not just the beginning of talks, but the result of a long and complex journey of decisions, reactions, and growing pressure that has brought both sides to this critical point.
And this is exactly why understanding the past is the first step to understanding the present. When we hear the phrase ceasefire talks, it may sound simple and straightforward, but in reality, it represents a very detailed and carefully managed process where leaders, diplomats, and representatives from different sides come together to reduce tension and create a pause in conflict. And during these talks, the main goal is not only to stop active confrontation, but also to build a basic level of communication that allows both sides to express their concerns, explain their positions, and explore possible ways to avoid further escalation. Because without communication, misunderstandings can grow quickly, and that can lead to even more serious situations.
That is exactly right, Julia. Because ceasefire talks are not just about stopping actions for a short time, but about creating an opportunity where both sides can think more clearly and make decisions with less pressure. And during these negotiations, each side usually comes with specific goals, which may include reducing immediate risks, protecting their interests, and gaining time to assess the situation more carefully. And while these goals may not always be the same for both sides, the talks create a space where these differences can be discussed instead of expressed through actions that increase tension.
Yes, Adam. And it is also important to understand what actually happens during these discussions, because many people imagine ceasefire talks as a single meeting or a quick agreement. But in reality, they often involve multiple stages, where representatives meet, exchange ideas, propose conditions, and respond to each other's concerns. And this process can take time because both sides need to carefully consider what they are willing to accept and what they are not. And in many cases, there may also be mediators or international observers involved who help guide the conversation and keep it focused on reducing tension.
Absolutely, Julia, and this is where the idea of strategy becomes very important. Because during ceasefire talks, each side is not only thinking about the present moment, but also about the future. And this means that every decision, every statement, and every agreement is carefully planned, because leaders want to make sure that any step they take does not weaken their position or create new challenges later. And this is why negotiations can sometimes seem slow or complicated, because they involve balancing immediate needs with long-term goals.
Exactly, Adam. And one of the key things we need to clarify for our listeners is the difference between a temporary ceasefire and a long-term peace agreement. Because these two ideas are often confused, but they are actually very different in both purpose and impact. And a temporary ceasefire is usually a short-term arrangement where both sides agree to stop active conflict for a limited period of time, often to reduce immediate risks, allow humanitarian support, or create space for further discussions. But it does not necessarily solve the deeper issues that caused the conflict in the first place.
That is a very important distinction, Julia, because a long-term peace agreement goes much further than a temporary ceasefire, as it aims to address the root causes of the conflict, including political disagreements, security concerns, and long-standing tensions. And reaching such an agreement requires much deeper negotiation, stronger commitment, and often the involvement of multiple parties, because it is not just about stopping conflict, but about creating a stable and lasting solution that both sides are willing to accept and maintain over time.
Yes, Adam, and this is why ceasefire talks are often seen as the first step rather than the final solution, because they create a moment where tension is reduced and communication becomes possible. And once that communication begins, it can open the door to more detailed discussions about long-term solutions. But it is important to remember that not every ceasefire leads to a lasting peace agreement, because there are still many challenges that need to be addressed before a stable outcome can be achieved.
And another important point to consider is that during ceasefire talks, Both sides are often trying to understand each other's intentions more clearly, because in times of tension, uncertainty can be very high, and when countries are unsure about what the other side might do next, they may act more cautiously or more defensively, and this is why communication during negotiations plays such a critical role, because it helps reduce uncertainty and allows both sides to make more informed decisions.
I completely agree, Adam. And this is also where diplomacy becomes very important, because diplomacy is the process of managing relationships between countries through communication, negotiation, and mutual understanding. And in situations like this, diplomacy is often the most effective way to reduce risks and prevent further escalation, because it focuses on dialogue rather than confrontation, and it allows both sides to explore solutions that may not be possible through direct conflict.
Exactly, Julia. And what makes diplomacy so powerful is that it creates options, because when countries are willing to talk and listen, they are more likely to find ways to manage their differences without increasing tension. And while diplomacy may not always lead to immediate results, it plays a key role in maintaining stability and creating opportunities for progress, especially in complex situations where quick decisions can lead to unintended consequences.
And it is also important to understand that ceasefire talks require patience, because progress does not always happen quickly, and there may be moments where discussions become difficult or slow. But even in those moments, the fact that communication continues is a positive sign, because it shows that both sides are still willing to engage rather than move toward further escalation. And this willingness to continue talking is often an important step toward reducing long-term risks.
Yes, Julia, and this is why we should not see ceasefire talks as a simple solution, but as a process that requires time, effort, and careful decision-making. Because every step in the negotiation matters, and even small agreements can help build trust over time. And as trust increases, the chances of reaching a more stable and lasting outcome also improve, which is why these talks are such an important part of international relations.
So when we think about ceasefire talks in this situation, we should see them as a moment where the focus shifts from action to communication, from pressure to dialogue, and from uncertainty to cautious understanding. Because even though challenges still remain, the decision to begin talks shows that there is at least some willingness on both sides to explore a different path.
Because in the end, ceasefire talks are not just about stopping conflict, but about creating the possibility for something better, where communication replaces confrontation, and where careful thinking replaces immediate reaction.
And that is why understanding ceasefire talks is so important, because they show us that even in the most difficult situations, there is always a space for dialogue, and that space can make all the difference.
When we ask the question, why now, in relation to ceasefire talks between the United States and Iran, it is important to understand that the timing of these discussions is rarely accidental, because in global politics, moments of negotiation often appear when pressures, risks, and opportunities intersect in ways that make dialogue more necessary and more practical. And one of the first factors that can influence this timing is military pressure. Because when forces on the ground, in the air, or in strategic regions begin to signal potential escalation, leaders may realize that continuing without negotiation could lead to outcomes that are difficult to manage, and this understanding can create a sense of urgency to start talks before conflict grows beyond control.
Yes, Adam. And what makes this point so interesting is that timing in diplomacy is almost always a strategic decision rather than a coincidence, because leaders, diplomats, and advisors constantly observe events and assess risks, looking for moments when initiating dialogue could be most effective. And in situations like this, starting ceasefire talks now may be seen as a way to manage pressure, reduce uncertainty, and demonstrate a willingness to engage constructively, while also signaling to the world that both sides are thinking carefully about the consequences of continued escalation, which in itself can influence public perception and international reactions.
Another reason for the timing of these talks could be economic challenges, because nations are not only influenced by military developments, but also by financial realities. and when countries face economic pressures, sanctions, or disruptions to trade and investment. Leaders may see negotiation as a necessary tool to prevent further economic harm, and this economic dimension can be very strong, because prolonged tension can harm businesses, weaken currency, and create domestic dissatisfaction, all of which can motivate a government to participate in talks even if core disagreements remain unresolved.
Exactly, Adam. And we also need to consider the influence of international actors in shaping the timing of negotiations, because countries do not exist in isolation, and global powers, allies, or regional organizations can apply pressure, suggest mediation, or create incentives for dialogue. And this kind of international influence often plays a subtle but critical role in prompting discussions, because leaders know that ignoring these pressures can increase isolation, reduce credibility, or create reputational risks on the global stage. And when multiple actors push for talks, the timing becomes almost inevitable.
Yes, Julia, and another aspect is that timing can reflect an effort to seize opportunity, because in global politics, waiting too long can allow tensions to spiral further, while acting too early might create a perception of weakness or lack of leverage, and therefore, leaders often look for a window of opportunity when initiating talks can maximize the chance of a positive response, minimize risk, and show strategic thinking. And in this sense, the beginning of ceasefire talks may signal that both sides believe the moment is right to pause, communicate, and explore potential solutions.
And we should also consider that timing can be linked to internal politics, because leaders on both sides may face pressures from domestic audiences, including political parties, military institutions, or public opinion. And when internal pressures grow, negotiating at the right moment can serve multiple purposes, such as showing responsiveness, protecting national interests, or creating space for further planning, which is why timing in diplomacy is often carefully calculated to align both internal and external factors.
Yes, Julia, and another reason for the timing of these talks could be the accumulation of multiple pressures simultaneously. Because when military tension, economic strain, and international influence converge, the situation can reach a tipping point where continuing without communication would create too many risks. And in that moment, starting ceasefire talks is a rational and strategic choice because it allows leaders to regain control over the narrative, reduce uncertainty, and open a pathway to potential resolution before matters worsen.
Absolutely, Adam. And this is why we often see timing in international negotiations as a reflection of careful calculation, because governments and leaders constantly monitor the environment, assessing not only their own position, but also the likely responses of the other side. And in situations like this, initiating talks now may be seen as the most prudent choice to manage risk, maintain credibility, and create conditions for further dialogue without committing fully to a long-term solution before it is feasible.
Another important aspect is that timing can also be influenced by external crises or events in other regions, because global politics is interconnected, and sometimes events in neighboring countries or global economic trends create additional pressure for leaders to act. And in this context, starting ceasefire talks may be influenced not only by bilateral concerns but also by the broader international environment, including shifts in alliances, regional stability, and global expectations, all of which add urgency to dialogue.
Yes, Adam. And it is also worth noting that the perception of urgency itself can influence timing, because when both sides believe that immediate action is necessary to prevent escalation, this sense of urgency can drive decision-makers to the negotiating table more quickly than they might have planned otherwise. And this is why global crises often accelerate talks, as leaders weigh the risks of delay against the potential benefits of immediate dialogue, recognizing that each day can change the dynamics and increase uncertainty.
And we must not forget that timing can also serve a signaling function, because initiating talks at a particular moment can communicate intentions to both domestic and international audiences, showing that a country is responsible, willing to engage, and aware of the consequences of further conflict. And these signals can reduce the likelihood of misinterpretation, build trust, and create a foundation for more structured discussions, all of which are crucial in complex situations where miscommunication can easily escalate tension.
Exactly, Adam. And this signaling aspect is reinforced by media coverage, public statements, and international commentary. Because the world is always watching high-stakes negotiations, and when leaders begin talks at the right moment, it can create confidence, shape perceptions, and influence the behavior of other countries, which can further stabilize the situation and encourage positive outcomes even before substantive agreements are reached.
Timing can also be shaped by negotiation strategy itself, because starting talks at a moment of calculated pressure can improve leverage, allowing a side to secure better outcomes without resorting to conflict. And this is why timing is often linked to the strategic positioning of both sides, as they weigh risks, potential gains, and the broader context, recognizing that acting too early or too late can weaken their bargaining position and reduce the chances of productive dialogue.
Yes, Adam. And in conclusion, the decision to begin ceasefire talks now reflects a combination of military, economic, and international pressures, combined with strategic calculation and awareness of risk. Because global leaders know that timing can make the difference between a discussion that de-escalates conflict and one that fails. And this is why understanding why talks happen at a particular moment helps us see the complexity behind decisions that might otherwise appear sudden or surprising.
So, as we move forward in our discussion, it is clear that the timing of these talks is not random, but the result of careful observation, strategic planning, and multiple converging pressures that pushed both sides toward dialogue, showing that in global politics, when the moment is right, even tense adversaries may find space for communication and negotiation, because timing can be just as important as the content of the talks themselves.
And this is a crucial lesson for our listeners, because understanding timing in diplomacy allows us to see that every action, every signal, and every choice about when to engage can shape the course of events, and that behind every announcement there is a thoughtful calculation aimed at managing risk, reducing tension, and opening the door to possible solutions. Adam, as we move into the heart of today's discussion, one of the most frequently asked questions by observers around the world is whether the United States is losing control over the situation with Iran. And it is a question that seems simple at first but becomes much more complex when we examine the details. Because in international relations, the appearance of control does not always reflect the reality of strategy, and moments that look like weakness to some may actually be carefully planned moves designed to influence outcomes, manage risks, and shape perceptions both domestically and internationally.
Exactly, Julia. And when we consider this question, it helps to understand that there are generally two ways people interpret the U.S. decision to engage in ceasefire talks at this moment. One perspective suggests that entering discussions, especially under pressure or after a series of escalations, might be seen as a sign that the U.S. is struggling to maintain full control over events, because some observers believe that if a country truly had the situation under control, it would not need to pause and negotiate, but instead could dictate terms and enforce its preferred outcome without compromise. And this view often emphasizes visible strength and unilateral action as the measure of control.
Yes, Adam. And the reason this perspective gains attention is because many people naturally associate control with the ability to act decisively without the need for consultation or negotiation. And when a major power like the United States moves toward talks, it may appear to some as a response to pressure rather than a proactive strategy, especially when deadlines, threats, or regional tensions seem to force engagement. And in the eyes of critics, this timing can be interpreted as a reactive step, suggesting that the initiative may have shifted, at least temporarily, away from the US.
However, Julia, the second perspective presents a very different interpretation, which is that participating in ceasefire talks is not necessarily a sign of weakness at all, but rather a demonstration of strategic and smart diplomacy, because diplomacy allows a country to manage risk, reduce immediate conflict, and shape outcomes without resorting to direct confrontation. And from this point of view, choosing to negotiate while maintaining other tools of influence can be seen as a deliberate and calculated method of exerting power, because control in global politics often involves guiding the situation quietly rather than forcing it openly.
Exactly, Adam. And this perspective highlights that leadership in international affairs is not always about visible dominance or immediate enforcement, but about timing, communication, and influence. And when a country engages in talks strategically, it is often maintaining more control than it appears, because it is using diplomacy to shape the reactions of others, protect long-term interests, and prevent escalation that could spiral out of control. And this type of subtle management is often harder to observe than traditional displays of power, but it can be equally, if not more, effective.
That is a very important distinction, Julia, because it reminds our listeners that control and strategy are not always the same. And while some may equate negotiating with losing control, in reality, these talks can represent an effort to steer the situation deliberately, using dialogue as a tool to balance competing pressures, maintain credibility, and keep options open for future action, all of which are essential components of sophisticated diplomacy in complex international environments.
Yes, Adam. And this is why it is so important to encourage critical thinking rather than accepting simple labels like weak or strong, because international relations are rarely black and white, and the same action can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on perspective, context, and available information. And by analysing both sides of the argument, we can better understand the nuances behind each decision and the reasoning that may guide leaders in high-pressure situations.
Another factor to consider, Julia, is that even when a country engages in talks, it often maintains other forms of leverage simultaneously, including military positioning, economic influence, and alliances, and these measures can be used to reinforce negotiation power, so the presence of dialogue does not necessarily indicate a lack of control, but rather a multi-layered approach where visible negotiation complements other forms of strategic influence, ensuring that the country can respond effectively no matter how the situation develops.
Absolutely, Adam. And this is why public perception can sometimes be misleading, because people often judge control based on what they see in headlines or in short-term actions, without understanding the broader picture, which includes preparation, strategy, and ongoing management of multiple variables. And in the case of the United States and Iran, it is important to remember that appearing willing to talk may actually enhance influence rather than diminish it, because it allows the US to guide outcomes while reducing the risk of uncontrolled escalation.
Yes, Julia. And it is also worth noting that maintaining credibility and flexibility at the same time is a core challenge in high-stakes diplomacy, because a country must demonstrate strength to its allies and domestic audience while also showing a willingness to negotiate to prevent conflict. And finding the balance between these two objectives is a hallmark of skilled diplomatic management, which means that the question of losing control cannot be answered simply by looking at a single action in isolation.
Exactly, Adam. And this balance is further complicated by the fact that both sides have their own strategic goals, which may not always align with immediate public expectations, and in many cases appearing willing to engage in talks can serve as a signal that a country is confident in its position, because it is using negotiation as a deliberate tool rather than as a reaction to weakness. And this is why analysing control requires understanding both perception and strategy simultaneously.
So when we reflect on the question of whether the United States is losing control, we see that there are multiple interpretations, and each perspective has its own logic and supporting evidence. And the more balanced view is that control in international relations often involves a combination of visible action, careful planning, strategic negotiation, and risk management, rather than unilateral dominance. And this allows leaders to maintain influence even in situations where immediate outcomes are uncertain.
And for our listeners, the key takeaway is that in global politics, moments that appear to show weakness can sometimes reflect careful strategy. And conversely, strong displays of power may hide underlying vulnerability, which is why it is essential to look beyond surface appearances and think critically about how decisions are made, what pressures exist, and how multiple factors influence the actions of any country in a complex international situation.
Ultimately, Julia, this means that asking whether the US is losing control is less about labeling and more about analyzing the situation thoughtfully, considering multiple perspectives, and recognizing that diplomacy, timing, and strategy often work together in ways that are not immediately visible. And understanding these dynamics helps us appreciate the careful balance that leaders must achieve to navigate tense international relations effectively.
And as we continue our discussion in the next section, we will explore how Iran perceives these talks and the broader implications for the region, because understanding both sides of the negotiation helps us gain a clearer picture of the challenges, strategies, and potential outcomes that make this moment in global politics so critical.
As we explore this next part of our discussion, it's important to try to understand Iran's possible goals and motivations in this moment, because when a country enters or even considers negotiations during a conflict, it does so with its own strategic interests in mind. And for Iran, these interests are shaped by a combination of regional influence, internal politics, historical experience with foreign powers, and the desire to protect its own security and autonomy in a highly competitive global environment. And this means that Iran's position in any talk is not simply reactive, but deeply rooted in how it perceives its future and its role in the Middle East.
Yes, Adam. And what makes this especially interesting is that Iran may see the possibility of talks not as a surrender or a sign of weakness, but as an opportunity to secure advantages that serve its long-term interests. Because even when tensions are high, negotiation can be a space where a country tries to protect what it values most, whether that is influence over neighboring regions, economic relief, or international recognition of its position. And in the case of Iran, the leadership likely views any discussion through the lens of historical experiences with external powers, including mistrust of Western intentions and a strong focus on preserving national sovereignty, which influences how they approach diplomacy.
Exactly, Julia. And one key strategic interest for Iran is maintaining and expanding its regional influence, because Iran has long seen itself as a central power in the Middle East, and influence in this region gives it leverage over political and security issues that extend far beyond its borders. From relations with neighboring countries to its support of allied groups in places like Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. And in negotiations, Iran could use the opportunity to reinforce its position, push for recognition of its role, and try to shape the rules of engagement in a way that secures its interests without weakening its standing among allies.
Yes, Adam. And another important aspect of Iran's strategy is political messaging both domestically and abroad. Because how a government presents its decisions can influence public opinion, morale, and international perception. And in a situation where there has been conflict, internal protests, and economic challenges, Iran's leaders may be cautious about appearing to make concessions under pressure, which could be interpreted by some as weakness, or may undermine their legitimacy at home, especially when state media and political slogans emphasize resistance against external interference and uphold national pride.
That is a very important point, Julia, because political messaging can shape how people interpret negotiations. And for Iran, messaging that reinforces strength, independence, and strategic calm could be just as significant as the actual content of any talks. And this means that Iran's public statements may emphasize negotiation only on terms that protect its core interests, while its negotiators work behind the scenes to explore where compromise may be possible without undermining their main goals, such as security guarantees or recognition of rights related to development and defense.
Another factor to consider in Iran's strategy is its economic situation, because after years of sanctions and economic challenges, Iranian leaders may see engagement in talks as a potential pathway to reduce economic pressure, attract investment, or improve trade conditions, which could have significant impacts on everyday life for people inside Iran. And while economic considerations might not always be publicly emphasized, they are an important part of any country's calculus when deciding whether to negotiate or continue costly conflict.
Yes, Julia. And it is also worth noting that Iran may view talks as an opportunity to shift the narrative away from direct conflict and toward a framework that balances negotiation with deterrence. Because even if Iran does not fully trust the intentions of the United States or other foreign powers, entering discussions can create space to manage tensions more predictably, protect its strategic interests, and avoid outcomes that could create even greater instability in the region, especially when multiple neighboring countries and global powers are watching closely.
Exactly, Adam. And this is why negotiations can be seen as an opportunity rather than a weakness, because they allow Iran to articulate its own conditions, priorities, and red lines in a forum that involves communication rather than confrontation. And if Iran can secure terms that enhance its influence, protect its sovereignty, and provide economic or security benefits, then talks become a strategic tool rather than simply a response to pressure, which is why Tehran's leaders may be cautious, but also interested in finding a constructive way to engage.
Another strategic interest for Iran in this context may be the desire to influence how other regional actors view the conflict. Because building or maintaining strong relationships with neighboring countries, mediators, and economic partners can strengthen Iran's position regardless of the outcome of the talks. And participation in negotiations can signal to others that Iran is acting as a responsible actor in the international system, even while it insists on protecting its core interests and national priorities.
Yes, Adam. And this also connects to how Iran balances its internal political divisions, because not all voices within the country may agree on the same approach, and negotiation can provide a platform where Iranian leadership can manage competing pressures within the government, while presenting a unified stance externally, which can help maintain stability domestically at a time when external pressures and public expectations may be high.
Another point to consider is that Iran's leadership may view talks as a way to avoid further escalation that could threaten its long-term security. Because while deterrence through military strength remains important, direct confrontation with a global power carries high risks, and any chance to reduce that risk through negotiation can be strategically valuable, even if full agreement is not easily achievable. And this understanding can shape how Iran approaches the timing, tone, and content of discussions.
Yes, Adam, and this shows that Iran's strategy is not simplistic, but rather a combination of many goals that balance security, influence, internal politics, economic needs, and international perception, which means that any negotiation is likely structured around these multiple interests rather than a single objective, and understanding this complexity helps explain why Iran may engage cautiously and selectively in ceasefire talks.
So as we analyze Iran's position, we see that it is shaped by not only immediate pressures but also long-term calculations involving how the country positions itself regionally, how its leaders communicate with both domestic and international audiences, and how it manages the balance between negotiation and deterrence. And while the path forward remains uncertain, these strategic interests help explain why Iran may view talks as an opportunity to protect and even enhance its interests in a complex global environment.
And understanding this broader perspective, including regional influence and political messaging, helps us appreciate that Iran's engagement in talks is not random or reactive, but part of a strategic calculation that considers multiple layers of national interest, which is why these discussions are so significant for both countries and the wider region. As we continue our discussion, it is important to understand that conflicts like this are rarely isolated between just two countries, because when we look at global issues today, major powers often play a broader role behind the scenes. And in the case of ceasefire talks involving the United States and Iran, several other countries and international organizations are watching closely, influencing decisions, and indirectly shaping the direction of negotiations. Because in today's interconnected world, the interest of one nation is often linked to strategic partnerships, alliances, and global stability, which means that what happens between these two nations can have implications far beyond their borders, drawing in global powers whose influence matters in shaping how talks proceed and how outcomes are viewed internationally.
Yes, Julia. And one of the first ways that global powers influence negotiations is through diplomatic pressure. Because nations with strong political relationships often use diplomacy to encourage certain outcomes, either by supporting one side, urging restraint, or promoting dialogue. And this diplomatic pressure can be subtle or direct, depending on the situation. And when influential countries send messages of support for ceasefire talks, it can create an environment where negotiation becomes not only possible but expected, because allies and international partners can reinforce the idea that responsible diplomacy is the best path forward to reduce risks and maintain regional stability, rather than allowing conflict to escalate with unpredictable consequences.
Exactly, Adam. And this diplomatic pressure is often not just one message but many, because global powers, regional organizations, and international institutions can all communicate expectations, warnings, or encouragements simultaneously, creating a complex web of influence that invites countries in conflict to consider not only their own position, but also how the world is reacting. And when these multiple signals align, they can push both sides toward dialogue, because leaders are aware that international support, credibility, and future cooperation may be shaped by how they respond to global calls for negotiation and restraint.
Another important way that global powers influence the situation is through economic partnerships. Because the global economy today is deeply interconnected, and countries often rely on trade, investment, and financial cooperation with others, which means that economic leverage can be just as powerful as diplomatic dialogue. And when influential nations or economic blocs signal that they favor talks, reduce sanctions, or offer economic incentives for cooperation, it can have a direct impact on how nations approach negotiations, because economic stability and growth are key priorities for governments. And reducing economic pressure through constructive dialogue can create powerful motivation to pursue ceasefire discussions.
Yes, Adam. And it is worth noting that economic influence does not only involve sanctions or trade agreements, but also long-term investments, international financial support, and access to global markets, which many nations consider carefully when they decide whether to remain in conflict or pursue negotiation. Because continuing tension can disrupt trade, increase costs, and create uncertainty that affects ordinary people, businesses, and the national economy. And when major partners signal that economic cooperation may improve through talks, it can shape the calculations of leaders who weigh political goals against the well-being of their citizens and future prosperity.
Exactly, Julia. And this shows how global powers, whether through diplomatic encouragement or economic incentives, create an environment where ceasefire talks can become a more attractive option than continued escalation, because the influence of external partners is part of the broader context that shapes negotiations. And this influence often occurs quietly through diplomatic channels, international summits, public statements, and even economic forecasts that signal what may happen if conflict continues or if talks succeed.
And another layer to this is the role of international organizations, like the United Nations or regional bodies, which often serve as platforms for global cooperation, providing space for negotiation, monitoring compliance, and offering frameworks for dialogue. And when these organizations advocate for reduced tension and peaceful resolution, they add another voice to the international chorus, encouraging negotiation, which further changes the environment in which countries decide whether to continue confrontation or pursue ceasefire talks.
Yes, Julia, and it is also important to understand that global powers do not always agree with each other, and sometimes they have conflicting interests. But even in those situations, their influence can shape the dynamics of negotiations, because the presence of multiple perspectives can lead to new avenues for dialogue, coalition building, and compromise. As countries find ways to balance competing pressures while still pursuing a stable outcome, showing that international involvement is not always about control, but about the complex interplay of relationships that shape global decision-making.
Another effect of global involvement is that it highlights how interconnected conflicts have become. Because in our modern world, a dispute between two nations can quickly attract attention from allies, economic partners, regional organizations, and international institutions, each of which brings its own priorities, expectations, and tools for influence. And this means that the path to negotiations is shaped by multiple forces working simultaneously, which can either support dialogue or create additional complexity that leaders must navigate carefully.
Absolutely. And this interconnectedness also shows why global powers pay attention not only to the content of negotiations, but also to the process, because when talks begin, it signals a willingness to reduce tension, which can encourage other nations to participate in peacekeeping, economic cooperation, and diplomatic support. While continued escalation can discourage investment, disrupt regional stability, and strain relations, and global powers are aware that how a conflict evolves can affect not only the immediate region, but the broader patterns of international relations.
Yes, Adam, and this is why major global players often emphasize not just negotiation, but responsible negotiation, encouraging both sides to pursue talks with clarity, respect for international norms, and a focus on reducing risk rather than creating additional uncertainty. Because when influential nations publicly support dialogue, it sends a message that the world is watching and that cooperation, rather than confrontation, is the preferred path forward for long-term stability.
Another point to consider is that global powers, even when they have different priorities, often share a common interest in preventing major conflict, because large-scale instability can disrupt global markets, create humanitarian crises, and strain diplomatic relationships that matter far beyond the immediate situation. And this shared interest can become a powerful force behind negotiations, encouraging all parties to consider the broader consequences of their decisions and to explore diplomatic solutions that reduce risks for the larger international community.
Yes, Adam, and this shared interest often leads to coordinated diplomatic efforts, where multiple countries work together to encourage talks, facilitate communication, and create frameworks that support negotiation rather than confrontation, which shows that international influence is not always about pressure, but about creating an environment where dialogue can happen more naturally and more effectively. Because when leaders see global support for calm, they may feel more confident in pursuing discussions that reduce tension.
So when we look at the role of global powers in this context, we see that their influence goes beyond simple observation, shaping both the timing and substance of negotiations through diplomatic pressure, economic partnerships, and shared interests in stability. And this helps explain why ceasefire talks often involve not just the primary countries in conflict, but a larger international community whose voices matter in how the outcome unfolds.
And by understanding this broader international impact, our listeners can see that conflict and negotiation are rarely isolated, but are shaped by a network of influences that reflect the interconnected nature of our world, where global powers, partnerships, and shared interests all play a role in determining the path toward dialogue, cooperation, and potential resolution.
Because in the end, global politics is not just about the direct relationship between two countries, but about how their interactions intersect with the broader international system. And that system helps shape the possibilities, pressures, and choices that leaders face as they move toward negotiation, showing us once again that in today's world, conflicts are rarely contained, but always connected. As we continue our discussion, it is crucial to consider the potential risks if the ceasefire talks between the United States and Iran do not succeed. Because while negotiations offer hope for reduced tension, failure to reach an agreement can create a range of challenges, both immediate and long-term, for the countries involved as well as for the wider region. And understanding these risks is important for seeing why leaders approach discussions carefully, because even small missteps or miscommunications can amplify existing tensions. And in the complex landscape of international relations, the consequences of failed talks extend far beyond the immediate conflict.
Yes, Adam, one of the most significant risks of failed negotiations is the possibility of conflict escalation. Because when dialogue breaks down, countries may interpret silence or hesitation as a lack of seriousness, which can lead to military posturing, heightened alert, or even direct confrontation. And this escalation does not just affect the main parties involved, but can also draw in regional allies, neighbouring countries, and international powers who may have a stake in the outcome, which means that what begins as a bilateral issue can quickly become a wider, more complicated regional problem.
Exactly, Julia. And escalation can take multiple forms, from increased military exercises near borders to targeted strikes or other demonstrations of force. And even if these actions do not lead to open war immediately, they can create an environment of uncertainty and tension that affects diplomacy, trade, and daily life. Because both governments and citizens begin to prepare for scenarios that could become much more serious, which can, in turn, make future negotiations even more difficult to restart as mistrust grows and the stakes rise.
Yes, Adam. And another risk of failed talks is the potential for regional instability, because the Middle East is a highly interconnected area where decisions in one country can affect neighbouring nations in terms of security, economics, and politics. And if the ceasefire does not hold, there could be a ripple effect that influences everything from oil markets to refugee flows to regional alliances, which can put additional pressure on countries that are already trying to balance multiple internal and external challenges.
Another point to consider is that the failure of talks can weaken confidence in diplomacy itself, because if negotiations are attempted but quickly collapse, leaders and citizens alike may begin to doubt the effectiveness of dialogue as a tool to resolve conflicts, which can encourage reliance on more forceful or unilateral measures. And this could make international cooperation more difficult in the future, as trust between countries diminishes and the perception of unpredictability grows in the eyes of allies and partners.
Yes, Adam. And this is why even the perception of failure matters, because in international relations, signals are as important as actions. And when negotiations are not successful, the interpretation of that failure can influence future strategies, alliances, and decisions by countries both within and outside the immediate conflict, creating a chain reaction that adds uncertainty and complicates the global political landscape.
Additionally, failed talks can have economic consequences, because continued tension or the threat of conflict can disrupt trade, increase the cost of energy, create investment uncertainty, and impact regional economies, which in turn affects everyday citizens, businesses, and government planning, making the stakes of negotiation very practical as well as strategic, because maintaining stability is often as much about economic well-being as it is about military or political concerns.
Absolutely, Adam. And one more risk to consider is the potential for miscommunication or misinterpretation to worsen the situation. Because in high-stakes negotiations, even small misunderstandings or unclear statements can lead to overreactions, miscalculations, or unintended escalation. And when multiple countries are involved, each interpreting messages through its own lens, the chances for unintended consequences increase, highlighting the fragility of the situation if talks fail.
Yes, Julia, and beyond immediate risks, failed negotiations could also affect long-term relationships, because countries remember how situations are handled, and repeated failures in diplomacy can make future dialogue more challenging, as trust is diminished and parties may become more cautious or skeptical about offers of compromise, which can prolong tension and reduce the likelihood of cooperative solutions down the line.
Another important consideration is humanitarian risk, because when conflict intensifies due to failed talks, civilians are often the most affected, facing disruptions to daily life, limited access to essential services, and the psychological burden of uncertainty. And while the goal of any country is to protect its citizens, the ripple effects of regional instability can create challenges that extend far beyond the original conflict zone, which is why maintaining dialogue is often prioritized alongside security concerns.
Yes, Julia, and environmental and infrastructure risks are also factors, because even limited military actions or regional instability can damage critical infrastructure, disrupt energy supplies, and affect public services, creating a wider impact on communities. And these consequences reinforce the importance of careful negotiation and strategic restraint, because the costs of escalation are rarely confined to military or political arenas alone.
And another point is that failed ceasefire talks can create uncertainty in global markets, because energy supplies, trade routes, and investment flows can be affected by regional instability, which has consequences not just locally, but internationally, as businesses, governments, and investors respond to the perceived risks, adding another layer of complexity to global politics and economics.
Exactly, Julia, and this highlights why international observers and mediators often emphasize the importance of sustained dialogue. Because while failure carries risks, continued negotiation, even if slow or incremental, can reduce the likelihood of escalation, maintain lines of communication, and create opportunities to manage disagreements before they become crises, showing that persistence and patience in diplomacy can be just as critical as decisive action.
So, as we reflect on the potential risks of failed talks, we see that the consequences are multi-layered, affecting military, economic, political, and humanitarian aspects. And while failure is always a possibility in international negotiations, awareness of these risks helps leaders, citizens, and observers appreciate the value of careful diplomacy, strategic planning, and international cooperation, reminding us that the stakes are high and that thoughtful engagement is essential to maintaining stability and reducing uncertainty.
Because in the end, failed negotiations are not just a setback for a single country. They can ripple across regions and globally, demonstrating the interconnected nature of today's world and the importance of careful, informed, and strategic decision-making when countries pursue peace, stability, and dialogue. As we reach the final part of today's discussion, it is important to pause and reflect on the lessons we can draw from the ongoing ceasefire talks between the United States and Iran. Because when we examine these events carefully, we see that ceasefires are not simply about stopping conflict temporarily, but are strategic tools used by nations to manage tension, maintain influence, and create opportunities for dialogue. And understanding this helps us see that international politics is rarely straightforward, as every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment, shaping both regional and global dynamics in ways that demand careful thought and analysis.
Absolutely, Adam. And one of the first points to remember is that strength is not always measured by force or immediate action, because in diplomacy, restraint can be a demonstration of power, patience, and foresight. And when leaders choose negotiation over confrontation, they are often exercising strategic influence that requires deep understanding of history, alliances, and the reactions of other countries, which shows us that global conflicts are complex systems where calm, thoughtful approaches can achieve outcomes that raw strength alone cannot, emphasizing the value of intelligence, planning, and long-term thinking in international relations.
Yes, Julia, and this also illustrates that global conflicts are influenced by multiple factors: military readiness, economic leverage, political messaging, and international opinion. And each action or statement can have ripple effects that affect other nations, partnerships, and future opportunities, which is why strategic decision-making is so critical, because leaders must weigh the immediate impact of their choices against long-term consequences, balancing risk, credibility, and national interests in a way that can determine whether peace is achievable or tension escalates further, highlighting the intricate nature of diplomacy in today's interconnected world.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, it is important to remember that modern power is not only about demonstrating dominance, but also about being able to influence outcomes without escalating conflict unnecessarily, because successful diplomacy allows nations to achieve objectives while preserving stability, maintaining alliances, and avoiding costly confrontation, which is a lesson that extends beyond politics, showing how thoughtful strategy and careful communication can be powerful tools in any situation where complex relationships and high stakes are involved.
Another key takeaway is that global situations like these are rarely linear or predictable, because each action can produce reactions that are sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, and often unexpected. And understanding these dynamics requires critical thinking, patience, and the ability to see beyond headlines to the deeper strategy at play. Because in international relations, The most important decisions are often made quietly, behind the scenes, where timing, subtlety, and context matter as much as visible actions, reminding us that knowledge and insight are central to understanding how power operates on the world stage.
Yes, Adam. And reflecting on this, we also see that diplomacy is an essential part of modern power, because nations that can communicate effectively, negotiate strategically, and respond thoughtfully to challenges often gain influence that exceeds what could be achieved through force alone. And this reinforces the idea that leadership in global politics requires a balance between assertiveness and patience, strength and understanding, showing that true power often lies in knowing when to act and when to engage in dialogue.
Another important lesson is that uncertainty is inherent in global affairs, because even the most carefully planned strategies can face unforeseen obstacles, from unexpected reactions by other countries to shifts in public opinion or sudden developments on the ground. And this uncertainty makes flexibility, careful observation, and informed decision-making crucial. Because in a world where outcomes cannot be guaranteed, the ability to adapt and respond thoughtfully often distinguishes successful strategies from failed ones, highlighting why knowledge, awareness, and critical thinking are invaluable tools for both leaders and observers alike.
Exactly, Adam. And this brings us back to our role as listeners and learners, because by examining situations like the US-Iran ceasefire talks, we can develop a deeper understanding of how the world operates, and we can appreciate that behind every headline, there are layers of strategy, negotiation, and calculated decision-making, which encourages us to think critically about global events, question simple narratives, and recognize that what may seem straightforward is often part of a far more complex and interconnected story that shapes the world we live in.
So, dear listeners, as we conclude today's episode, let us take away the understanding that in global politics, power is multifaceted, strategy is essential, and restraint can be as influential as action, because conflicts are rarely simple, and the most important insights often come from observing the interplay between patience, diplomacy, and long-term planning, which teaches us to look beyond immediate reactions and see the broader consequences that shape regional and global stability.
And finally, let us remember that in today's complex world, knowledge and awareness are forms of power, because when we take the time to understand the story behind the headlines, we are better equipped to think critically, form informed opinions, and appreciate the subtle ways that strategy, negotiation, and diplomacy shape our global community. In the words that perfectly close our discussion today, in a world shaped by strategy and uncertainty, understanding the story behind the headlines is the real power.